The first artillery shells had fallen hours ago, their distant thunder rolling through the ruins of Vukovar like a slow, malignant heartbeat. Sergeant Ante Dragic crouched behind a crumbling brick wall, his fingers tightening around the stock of his rifle. Around him, his men boys really dug shallow trenches, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat. The air stank of gunpowder and something older, something rotten beneath the rubble. "Keep moving." Ante barked, his voice hoarse. "Sandbags up front, snipers in the church tower. They'll hit us hard before dawn." Private Luka wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "They're already surrounding us. How long can we hold?" Ante didn't answer, he didn't have one. The radio crackled with static, a broken voice reporting Yugoslav armor advancing from the east. The Croats were outnumbered, outgunned, but Ante had made his choice. They would stand. Then, beneath the hum of distant engines, something else, a sob. Luka froze. "Did you hear that?" Ante scowled. "Focus on the enemy, not your nerves." But Marco, the oldest among them, turned his head slowly toward the skeletal remains of a nearby house. His voice was low, uneasy. That wasn't the wind. The sound came again, a man's weeping, raw and broken, drifting through the ruins. Ante's skin prickled. He raised a fist, signaling silence. The men stilled, rifles at the ready. Nothing. Then movement. A shadow flickered between the shattered buildings. A figure in a tattered uniform, hunched, shoulders shaking. Luka's breath hitched. Who the hell is? A shell screamed overhead. The world erupted in fire and noise. When the dust settled, the ghost, if it had ever been there, was gone. But the weeping lingered in Ante's ears, long after the echoes of the explosion faded. The apartment block was little more than a skeleton, walls pocked with bullet holes, floors collapsed into jagged teeth of broken concrete. Ante surveyed the ruins, his boots crunching over shattered glass and spent casings. The men had fortified the ground floor as best they could, sandbags stacked in crooked walls. A sniper's nest rigged in the hollowed-out stairwell. "Check your sectors," he ordered, voice rough. "Luka, Marco East windows. Watch for movement." Luka hesitated, his fingers twitching against his rifle. "Sergeant, I saw something out there earlier. A man or nothing." Ante cut in. "You're seeing shadows. Fatigue plays tricks." Marco leaned against the crumbling wall, his face unreadable in the dim light. "Or the dead walk here. This place, it's old ground. Blood soaks deep." A ripple of unease passed through the men. Someone muttered a prayer. Ante ignored it. "Save your stories for after the war." Eyes sharp. The night stretched thin, the only sounds the distant thump of artillery and the occasional skitter of rats in the rubble. Then soft at first came the weeping. Luka stiffened. There. Again, Ante clenched his jaw. Quiet. But the sound grew, a man's sobs, choked and broken, drifting through the ruins like smoke. It came from nowhere and everywhere, threading through the shattered windows. Marco exhaled sharply. "He's closer." A shape moved in the alley below, a hunched figure in a tattered uniform, its face hidden beneath a rust-stained helmet. One hand clutched at its chest, the other outstretched, fingers curled as if grasping for something lost. Luka's breath fogged the cracked glass as he pressed closer. "He's pointing." The radio erupted in static. A garbled voice, "Incoming, East Sector." The first shell hit before the warning ended. The world shattered in fire and noise. Plaster rained down as Ante shouted orders, but the sound was swallowed by the weeping soldier's wail, rising, terrible, before vanishing into the smoke. When the dust settled, the ghost was gone, But the east wall was gone too, and beyond it, the dark shapes of advancing troops. The silence after the shelling was worse than the explosions. Anti's ears rang, his vision swimming as he pushed himself up from the debris. The east wall had been blown open, leaving a gaping maw where sandbags and brick had once stood. Cold wind howled through the breach, carrying with it the stench of burning metal and wet earth. Luka was already at the shattered window, his rifle trembling in his hands. "They're coming," he whispered. "Sergeant, they're coming." Anti didn't need to look to know. The rhythmic crunch of boots on rubble, the low murmur of voices, Yugoslav troops advancing under cover of smoke. He swallowed the copper taste of blood and barked orders. "Marco, cover the breach. Luka, watch the flanks. The rest of you move." The men scrambled, their faces pale beneath the grime. Only Marco hesitated, his gaze locked on the alley where the weeping figure had stood moments before. "You saw him too," Luka said, voice cracking. He was pointing right where the shell hit. Anti grabbed Marco's shoulder, forcing his attention back. "Forget him. He's not real." Marco's eyes were dark, hollow. Then, why do the shells always follow? A burst of gunfire cut off any reply. The Croats returned fire, their muzzle flashes lighting up the ruined room in staccato bursts. Anti crouched low, counting shots, gauging the enemy's advance. But beneath the gunfire, beneath the shouts, and the static of the dying radio, the sound returned. Weeping. Closer this time. Luka whimpered, pressing himself against the wall. "He's in the stairwell." Anti spun, rifle raised. The stairwell was a black pit, half collapsed, its steps littered with broken concrete. But there between the shadows something moved. A slow, shuffling gait. The glint of a rusted helmet. Then the sobs came again, raw and wet, as if the man were choking on his own grief. Marco crossed himself. "He's not just warning us," he muttered. "He's mourning." A grenade clattered into the room. Anti barely had time to shout before the blast threw him backward. Heat seared his skin, the world dissolving into white noise. When his vision cleared, the ghost stood in the center of the room, close enough to touch. His uniform was more tatters than fabric, his face half rotted, the skin peeling back from yellowed bone. But his eyes, God, his eyes were alive with sorrow. He reached out, his fingers brushing empty air, his mouth working soundlessly around words that never came. Then the second grenade hit. The last thing Anti saw before the smoke swallowed everything was the ghost's outstretched hand, not pointing at the enemy, but at the Croats themselves. As if he had been trying to save them all along. The night was a living thing, thick with the scent of damp earth and cordite, the distant thump of artillery like a slow, irregular pulse. Anti leaned against the sandbagged wall of their makeshift trench, his fingers numb around his rifle. The men were silent, shadows hunched beneath the dim glow of a half moon. Even Marco, usually so quick with his grim stories, had gone quiet. Then it came. A sob, not the wind, not the creak of ruined buildings settling. A man's voice, raw and broken, carrying through the ruins like a funeral dirge. Luka flinched, his breath quickening. He's back. Anti didn't answer. He didn't need to. The sound was unmistakable now, the same hollow weeping from before, the same shuddering grief. But this time it wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. Marco exhaled, his breath fogging in the cold air. He's in the trench. A ripple of movement passed through the men. Rifles shifted, fingers twitching against triggers. Anti clenched his jaw. Eyes forward. It's just the dark playing tricks. But then the weeping stopped. Silence, the kind that made Auntie's skin crawl. Luca's whisper was barely audible. "Sergeant, look." Auntie turned. There, at the far end of the trench, stood the soldier. His uniform hung in tatters, the fabric stiff with old blood. His helmet was rusted through, the metal eaten away like rot. And his face, God, his face was a ruin of peeling flesh and exposed bone, his lips pulled back in a silent scream. But his eyes wide, wet, impossibly alive, locked onto Auntie's. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the ghost raised a skeletal hand, not in warning, not in threat, in pleading. A shell screamed overhead. The world erupted. Dirt and fire rained down as the trench shook, men shouting, stumbling, scrambling for cover. Auntie hit the ground hard, his ears ringing, his vision swimming. When the dust cleared, the ghost was gone. But the spot where he'd stood was scorched black, the sandbags torn apart by shrapnel. Luca coughed, blood flecking his lips. He wasn't pointing at the enemy, he rasped. He was pointing at us. Marco's voice was hollow, because he knew where the shells would land. Auntie didn't answer. He didn't trust himself to. Because for the first time he wondered, was the ghost trying to warn them? Or were they already dead and he was the only one who knew it? The radio crackled to life, a voice breaking through the static. "All units fall back. They're breaching the eastern line." Auntie looked up. Beyond the smoke, the first shadows of advancing troops moved through the ruins. And somewhere, beneath the chaos, the weeping began again. The fire in the oil drum had burned low, its flickering light casting long shadows across the faces of the men huddled around it. The night was cold, the kind that seeped into bones and made every breath a visible ghost. Auntie watched the embers, his fingers curled around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. The taste was bitter, like everything else in Vukovar. Marco leaned forward, his face gaunt in the firelight. "They say he was one of ours," he murmured, "executed in the first days of the siege, left in the ruins as a warning." Luca's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. "Who says?" "The locals, the ones who didn't flee." Marco's voice dropped lower, as if afraid the wind would carry his words to the wrong ears. "They whisper about him at night, a soldier who wouldn't stay dead, who comes back when the shells are about to fall." A murmur rippled through the men. Someone crossed himself. Auntie set his cup down with a sharp clink. "Enough. Ghost stories won't stop bullets." But Marco didn't back down. His eyes gleamed in the dim light. "You've seen him, Auntie. We all have. He's not just a story." Luca exhaled smoke, his voice thin. "He was in the trench last night, right where the shell hit." "Coincidence?" Auntie snapped. "Or a warning," Marco countered. "They shot him in the square right where the old fountain used to be. That's why he weeps. That's why he points." The fire crackled, the sound too loud in the sudden silence. Private Daver, younger than the rest, swallowed hard. "What if he's trying to save us?" Auntie's laugh was harsh. "Dead men don't save the living." But even as he said it, the memory of the ghost's outstretched hand flickered in his mind, rotted fingers reaching, not toward the enemy, but toward them. A gust of wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the faintest echo of a sob. The men stiffened. Luca's cigarette fell from his fingers, its ember hissing in the dirt. "You hear that?" Auntie did. They all did. The weeping was back, closer than ever. Marco stood slowly, his rifle gripped tight. "He's here." Auntie opened his mouth to order silence, but the radio crackled to life before he could speak. Incoming fire east sector. Take cover. The first explosion lit up the night before the warning finished. The ground shook, the fire in the oil drums snuffing out in an instant. Men scrambled, shouting, as the sky rained shrapnel and dirt. And through the chaos, beneath the roar of artillery, the ghost's wail rose, a sound so full of grief it seemed to split the world in two. Auntie caught a glimpse of him then, standing at the edge of their ruined camp, his tattered uniform fluttering in the blast wind. His face was a ruin, his mouth open in a silent scream. But his hand was outstretched, pointing straight at Auntie. Then the second shell hit. When the smoke cleared, the ghost was gone. But the message was clear. They were running out of time. The ruins of Vukovar loomed like broken teeth against the moonlit sky. Auntie crouched in the shadow of a collapsed apartment block, his breath fogging in the cold air. Behind him, Luca and Marco waited, their rifles slick with rain. The patrol had been Auntie's idea, a quick sweep of no man's land to scout enemy positions before dawn. But now, standing at the edge of the abyss, even he felt the weight of the darkness pressing in. "Keep close," Auntie muttered. "Single file." Luca watched the rear. Luca's fingers trembled as he adjusted his grip. "Sergeant, I don't like this." The ghost doesn't exist, Auntie snapped. "Eyes on the enemy, not shadows." Marco said nothing, but his gaze flickered toward the skeletal remains of a nearby house, the same one where they'd first heard the weeping. The patrol moved in silence, boots crunching over shattered glass and spent shell casings. The air reeked of wet earth and something fouler decay, thick and cloying. Every few steps, Auntie paused, listening for the telltale crunch of Yugoslav boots. But the night was eerily still, broken only by the distant thump of artillery and the skitter of rats in the rubble. Then soft at first a sound. Not rats. Not wind. Weeping. Luca froze. "He's here." Auntie clenched his jaw. "Keep moving." But the sound grew, a man's sobs echoing through the ruins like a funeral chant. It came from ahead, where the street narrowed into a choke point of collapsed buildings. Marco exhaled sharply. "He's waiting for us." Auntie raised a fist, signaling the men to halt. His pulse hammered in his throat as he scanned the darkness. Nothing. Then movement. A flicker of shadow between two crumbling walls. The weeping soldier stood there, his silhouette hunched, his helmet rusted through. Moonlight glinted off the exposed bone of his jaw, the tatters of his uniform fluttering in the breeze. This close, Auntie could see the rot the way his skin peeled back from his cheeks, the blackened tips of his fingers where flesh had sloughed away. Luca whimpered. "He's worse. He's worse than before." The ghost raised his head. His eyes his eyes were pools of liquid sorrow, fixed on Auntie. Then, slowly, he lifted one skeletal hand and pointed not at the patrol, but past them toward the Croatian lines. A warning. Marco's voice was a whisper. "He's telling us to turn back." Auntie's grip on his rifle tightened. "We're not." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static cutting him off. Then, a voice, garbled but urgent. "All units incoming fire. East sector. Take cover." The first shell screamed overhead before the transmission ended. The impact threw Auntie to the ground, the world dissolving into fire and noise. Dirt rained down as he rolled, shouting for the men to fall back. Through the smoke, he caught one last glimpse of the ghost, his mouth open in a soundless wail, his outstretched hand now curled into a claw. Then he was gone. The patrol ran, stumbling over rubble, the night alive with the roar of artillery. By the time they reached their lines, Luca was shaking, his face streaked with dirt and tears. He knew, he gasped. He knew the shells were coming. Marco's voice was hollow, and he tried to stop us. Auntie didn't answer. He stared back at the ruins, where the echoes of the ghosts weeping still lingered beneath the thunder of war. For the first time, he wondered if they were all already dead, and the weeping soldier was the only one who remembered. The ghost was always there before the shells fell. Auntie had stopped denying it. The men had stopped pretending they didn't see. Even the newest recruits' wide-eyed boys who'd arrived with fresh uniforms and unshaken nerves learned quickly. The weeping came first, soft as a whisper, then swelled into a wail that clawed at the back of the skull. By the time the ghost appeared, it was already too late. The artillery was inbound. Tonight was no different. Auntie crouched in the ruins of what had once been a bakery, the scent of burnt flour still clinging to the shattered ovens. The men were silent, their faces hollowed out by exhaustion. Lucas sat with his back against the wall, his fingers tracing the grooves of his rifle like a prayer. Marco smoked the last of his cigarettes, the ember glowing like a dying star in the dark. Then, inevitable as death, the sound began. A sob, ragged and wet, seeping through the cracks in the walls. Luca's head snapped up. He's close. Auntie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The air had gone thick, the way it did before a storm. The weeping grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from inside the room itself. Marco exhaled smoke. Third time this week, always before the big barrages. Private Daver, barely 18, clutched his rifle like a child clinging to a blanket. Why doesn't he just tell us where they'll hit? Because the dead don't speak, Marco said. They mourn. A shadow moved in the doorway. The weeping soldier stood there, his uniform hanging in tatters, his helmet rusted to his skull. His face was worse now, half gone, the flesh sloughing off in blackened strips, his jaw unhinged in a silent scream. But his eyes, God, his eyes were alive, brimming with tears that never fell. Luca made a sound like a wounded animal. He's looking at me. The ghost stepped forward. The men recoiled, rifles clattering against the floor. Only Auntie held his ground, his breath coming hard and fast. The ghost stopped an arm's length away, close enough for Auntie to see the maggots writhing in the hollow of his throat. Then he raised a skeletal hand, not pointing, not pleading, but counting. 1 finger. 2. 3. A pause. 4. The radio erupted in static. A voice, frantic, incoming. 4 shells east sector. The first impact hit before the warning ended. The world dissolved in fire and noise, the bakery's walls buckling inward. Auntie was thrown backward, his head striking stone. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the ghost's wail rise above the chaos, a sound so full of grief it seemed to tear the sky open. Then the second shell hit, and the third, and the fourth. When the dust settled, the ghost was gone, but the men had learned the pattern. The weeping soldier didn't just predict the shelling. He numbered it. Luca coughed blood onto the rubble. He's not warning us, he whispered. He's counting us. Marco's laugh was broken. Or counting down. Auntie stared at the empty doorway where the ghost had stood. The fourth shell had missed them by meters. A fluke. Luck. Or something worse. Because if the ghost was counting, what happened when he reached 0? Outside, the night trembled with the distant thunder of advancing tanks. And beneath it, barely audible, the weeping began again. The bread was gone. The last tin of beans had been split 3 ways, the watery broth licked clean from the edges. Auntie stared at the empty crate that had once held their rations, his stomach a hollow knot. Around him, the men sat slumped against the walls of their makeshift bunker, their faces gaunt beneath layers of dirt and stubble. The air reeked of sweat, gun oil, and the sickly sweet tang of infected wounds. Luka picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. They said the supply truck would come yesterday. They said a lot of things, Marco muttered, sharpening his knife against a stone. The scrape of metal filled the silence. Auntie rubbed his temples. The headache had started hours ago, a dull throb behind his eyes that no amount of willpower could shake. We hold until reinforcements arrive. That's the order. Daver, the youngest, let out a shaky breath. What if no one's coming? No one answered. The radio crackled to life, spitting static. A broken voice cut through, fall back east flank compromised before dissolving into noise. Auntie switched it off. Useless, like everything else. Luka's fingers drummed against his knee. What if the ghost's right? What if we're supposed to leave? Marco snorted. And go where? The whole city's a coffin. He knows when the shells are coming. Luka pressed, voice rising. He counted them last time. What if he's trying to? Enough. Auntie's fist hit the crate, the sound like a gunshot in the cramped space. The men flinched. You want to follow a corpse's orders? Fine. Walk out there, see how far you get. Silence. Then, from the dark corner of the room, a whisper better than waiting to die here. Auntie turned. It was Joseph, usually silent, his face still bandaged from the last shelling. His good eye gleamed in the dim light. For a moment, no one moved. Then Marco leaned forward, his voice low. You heard the stories. The ghost was one of ours, executed, left to rot. Maybe he doesn't want the same for us. Luka's laugh was brittle. Or maybe he wants company. The wind howled through the shattered windows, carrying with it the faintest echo of a sob. Every man stiffened. Auntie's hand went to his rifle. Quiet. The weeping grew louder, threading through the ruins like a poison. Not distant this time. Not outside. Inside. Luka's breath hitched. He's in the hallway. Auntie moved first, kicking open the door, rifle raised. The corridor was a black maw, the floor littered with broken plaster and spent casings. At the far end, a shadow shifted a hunched figure in a tattered uniform, its back turned. The ghost. Closer than ever. Marco crossed himself. Jesus save us. The weeping soldier turned slowly. His face was worse now, jaw unhinged, skin sloughing off in gray strips, his eyes two pits of endless sorrow. He raised a skeletal hand, fingers trembling, and pointed not at Auntie, not at the men, but at the floor beneath their feet. A warning. The radio exploded to life, a scream of static. Then, clear as death, incoming underground. Auntie didn't think. He roared, move. The men scrambled as the first shell hit the foundation. The world upended in a roar of collapsing stone and fire. Auntie was thrown forward, his vision whiting out. When it cleared, the bunker was half gone. The ceiling caved in, dust choking the air. And the ghost stood amid the wreckage, his mouth open in a soundless wail, his outstretched hand now curled into a fist. 4 fingers. Then 3. 2. Luka screamed. The next shell hit dead center. When the smoke cleared, the ghost was gone. So was half the wall. And beyond it, the distant glint of enemy scopes. Auntie dragged himself upright, his ears ringing. The men were alive barely. Luca clutched a bleeding arm. Davor sobbed into his hands. Marco spat out a tooth. Joseph wasn't moving. Auntie didn't check if he was breathing. He already knew. The ghost had counted down, and they were out of time. The silence was worse than the weeping. Luca pressed his back against the sandbags, his rifle cold in his hands. The night stretched thin around him, the ruins of Vukovar reduced to jagged silhouettes against the starless sky. The others slept or pretended to curled in the wreckage of what had once been a schoolhouse. Only the occasional rasp of breath betrayed they were still alive. He strained his ears. Nothing. No distant artillery. No skitter of rats in the rubble. Just the wind, sighing through broken glass like a mourner at a grave. That was the problem. The ghost always came before the shells. And tonight, there was only silence. Luca exhaled, his breath fogging in the air. His fingers ached from gripping the rifle too tight. He should sleep. He knew that. The bags under his eyes felt like bruises, his body a hollow shell of exhaustion. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the ghost's rotting face, his skeletal fingers counting down 4, 3, 2. A sound. Luca froze. Not the wind. Not the creak of settling ruins. A sob. Soft at first, barely more than a whisper. Then louder, raw and wet, as if the man were choking on his own grief. Luca's pulse spiked. He turned his head slowly, scanning the darkness. The schoolyard was a graveyard of shattered desks and bullet-pocked walls, the moonlight painting everything in shades of bone. There, between the skeletal remains of a swing set, a shadow. Not moving, not breathing, just standing. The weeping soldier. His uniform hung in tatters, the fabric stiff with old blood. His helmet was rusted through, the metal eaten away like rot. And his face, God, his face was worse than before. The flesh had peeled back from his skull entirely now, leaving only a rictus grin of yellow bone and blackened sinew. But his eyes wide, wet, impossibly alive, locked onto Luca's. A whimper escaped Luca's throat. He wanted to run, to scream, to wake the others. But his body refused to move, pinned beneath the weight of that gaze. The ghost raised a hand. Not pointing, not counting, beckoning. Luca's breath hitched. What do you want? The weeping swelled, filling the night, pressing against Luca's skull like a flood. The ghost's jaw worked soundlessly, his fingers trembling as he reached not toward Luca, but past him, toward the sleeping men, toward Auntie. A cold realization slithered down Luca's spine. He's not warning us. He's warning him. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static cutting through the night. Then, a voice, broken but clear. All units attack imminent. East sector, they're coming. Luca turned. Beyond the ruins, the darkness moved. Not ghosts. Not shadows. Men. Yugoslav troops, advancing under cover of night. The weeping soldier's wail rose to a shriek, his outstretched hand now clawing at the air. Then, the first mortar hit. The world erupted in fire and noise. And when the smoke cleared, the ghost was gone. But the night was alive with gunfire. And Luca knew the countdown was over. The weeping grew louder, closer. Luca's breath came in ragged gasps as he crouched behind the shattered remains of a school desk, the acrid stench of gunpowder burning his nostrils. The mortar blast had torn through their position, leaving a smoldering crater where the east wall had stood. Around him, men stirred, groaning, coughing, scrambling for rifles as the night erupted with muzzle flashes. But Luca couldn't tear his eyes away from the swing set. The ghost still stood there, his rotted silhouette framed by moonlight. His tattered uniform fluttered in the concussive wind of another explosion, his exposed jaw clenched in silent agony. And his eyes, those terrible, weeping eyes, were fixed not on the advancing enemy, but on Sergeant Ante, who was already barking orders into the chaos. A hand grabbed Luca's shoulder. Marco's face was a mask of soot and blood. "Move! Damn you! They're flanking us." Luca shook his head, throat tight. "He's here." Marco followed his gaze. For a heartbeat, the veteran froze. Then his grip tightened. "Then we're already dead." Another mortar screamed in. The blast threw them both to the ground, dirt and shrapnel raining down. When Luca lifted his head, the ghost was closer, just meters away now, his decayed face fully visible in the hellish glow of burning rubble. Up close, the rot was unbearable. The skin had sloughed away entirely from one cheek, revealing the hollow curve of his skull beneath. His lips were gone, teeth bared in a permanent grimace. But the tears thick, glistening streaks cutting through the grime were fresh. The ghost's mouth moved. No sound came out. But Luca heard it anyway, a whisper, threaded beneath the gunfire and the screams. "Run." Then movement. The ghost's skeletal hand snapped up, fingers splayed as if bracing against an invisible force. His head tilted, listening to something beyond the battle. Luca knew that silence, that terrible, breathless pause. The shells were coming. "Down," he screamed. The world split apart. Heat and noise swallowed everything. Luca was thrown backward, his ears ringing, vision swimming. When the dust settled, the swing set was gone, vaporized. The ghost, too, had vanished. But where he'd stood, the ground was untouched. A perfect circle of unbroken earth amid the devastation. Ante dragged Luca upright, his voice raw. "Snipers in the church tower. We fall back now." Luca stumbled, his legs numb. He glanced once more at the empty space where the ghost had been. The weeping had stopped. But the silence was worse. Because for the first time, the ghost hadn't just warned them. He'd shielded them. Marco grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the shattered hallway. "Don't look back." But Luca did. Beyond the smoke, beneath the wail of incoming artillery, the ruins seemed to breathe. And somewhere in the dark, a rusted helmet glinted, watching, waiting. The last shell of the night hit as they fled a direct strike on the schoolhouse roof. The ghost's wail rose one final time, a sound so full of grief it drowned out the explosion. Then, nothing. Only the distant crunch of enemy boots. And the terrible, unspoken truth. The weeping soldier had saved them. But the war wasn't done with them yet. The dawn light bled through the smoke, casting the ruins in a sickly pallor. Ante crouched in the shattered remains of a basement, his fingers tracing the map spread across an ammo crate. The ink had smudged from rain and sweat, the Yugoslav positions marked in shaky red pencil. "They'll hit the factory next," he muttered. "We pull back to the riverbank." "You're not listening." Marco's voice was rough, his hands clenched around his rifle. The ghost was pointing there last night, right where the shell hit. Ante didn't look up. Coincidence? Luca let out a broken laugh. He sat against the wall, his bandaged arm cradled to his chest. 4 times. 4 fucking times he's shown up before the barrages. You call that luck? The other men shifted, their eyes darting to the stairwell half collapsed, shadows pooling like blood. The ghost had been closer last night, close enough to touch. Ante slammed his fist on the crate, Enough. We're soldiers, not peasants scared of bedtime stories. He stabbed a finger at the map. The factory's our last fallback point. We hold there until. A sob. Soft. Guttural. The room went still. It came from the stairwell, a wet, shuddering sound, like a man choking on his own lungs. Daver, the youngest, whimpered. He's here. Ante's jaw tightened. He grabbed his rifle and stormed toward the stairs, boots crunching over broken glass. I'm done with this shit. The weeping grew louder as he climbed, the sound wrapping around his skull like barbed wire. The basement stairwell was a tomb of cracked concrete and exposed rebar, the air thick with the stench of mildew and old blood. At the top, moonlight spilled through a shattered window, painting the landing in jagged silver. And there, silhouetted against the glass, the soldier. His uniform hung in strips, the fabric fused to his rotting flesh. His helmet was gone, revealing the ruin of his face, jaw unhinged, lips peeled back from blackened teeth, one eye socket a hollow pit, the other eye, still weeping, fixed on Ante. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the ghost raised a skeletal hand. Not in warning, not in grief. Accusation. Ante's finger twitched on the trigger. You're not real. The ghost's mouth opened. A whisper slithered out, barely audible beneath the weeping. You left us. The radio in Ante's belt crackled to life. A voice, frantic, armor moving on the factory. The ghost's hand snapped toward the window, pointing east, toward the factory. Ante didn't turn. You're just in my head. The ghost stepped closer. The stench of decay hit Ante like a fist, rotting meat and damp earth. His remaining eye brimmed with tears that dripped onto Ante's boots, sizzling like acid. You left us to die, the ghost breathed. The radio screamed, incoming factory sector. The first shell hit as Ante stumbled back down the stairs. The basement shook, dust raining from the ceiling. Men shouted, scrambling for weapons as the world outside erupted in fire. Marco grabbed Ante's arm, his face wild. You saw him. He was warning us. Ante shoved him away. Move. Factory's lost, we fall back to the river. Luca didn't move. He stared at the stairwell, where the ghost's weeping still echoed. He wasn't pointing at the factory, he whispered. He was pointing at you. Another shell hit. The ceiling groaned. Ante roared over the chaos. I said, move. As the men fled into the burning streets, the ghost watched from the shattered window, his tears cutting through the smoke, his outstretched hand now curled into a fist. The factory exploded behind them, lighting up the dawn. And for the first time, the weeping stopped. But the silence was worse, because Ante knew. The ghost hadn't been warning them about the shells. He'd been warning what was coming. The warehouse loomed like a tomb in the gray dawn, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes, the roof sagging under the weight of neglect. Ante signaled the men to halt, his breath fogging in the frigid air. The silence here was absolute, no distant artillery, no rustle of rats in the rubble. Just the whisper of wind through shattered windows, carrying the scent of damp rot and something fouler beneath. Luca shifted beside him, his rifle trembling in his grip. This is it. The execution site. Marco spat into the dirt. Ground sour here, can't you feel it? Ante ignored the chill crawling up his spine, spread out. Check for supplies. Intel, anything usable. The men moved forward, boots crunching over broken glass and spent casings. The warehouse's interior was a graveyard of overturned chairs and rusted chains, the floor stained dark in jagged streaks. Ante's stomach turned. He'd seen enough war to know what those stains meant. Daver, pale-faced, nudged a pile of rags with his boot. The fabric unfurled a tattered uniform, its insignia torn away. Beneath it, a skeletal hand curled inward, as if clutching at a phantom wound. "Christ," Daver whispered. Luca's voice was hollow. They didn't even bury them. A gust of wind moaned through the ruins. Then, a sob. Not from the men. Not from the wind. From the far corner of the warehouse. Auntie's blood turned to ice. He knew that sound. They all did. The weeping soldier stood among the corpses, his silhouette hunched, his helmet rusted to his skull. His uniform was more rot than fabric now, the flesh beneath sloughing off in blackened strips. His face, what remained of it, was a ruin of exposed bone and weeping sores, his jaw hanging slack as grief poured from him in shuddering waves. Marco crossed himself. He's one of them. The ghost raised his head, his eyes still human, still alive with sorrow locked onto Auntie's. Then, slowly, he extended a skeletal hand, not pointing, not accusing, but pleading. Luca choked back a cry. "He wants us to see." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static. A voice broke in, heavy movement north sector. Auntie didn't move. Couldn't. The ghost's gaze held him rooted, drowning in that bottomless grief. Then the weeping stopped. The ghost's mouth moved, forming silent words. "You were too late." A shell screamed overhead. The warehouse erupted. Auntie hit the ground as the world dissolved in fire and noise, the ceiling collapsing in a rain of splintered wood and twisted metal. Through the smoke, he saw the ghost one last time standing amid the flames, his tattered uniform untouched, his face finally at peace. Then he faded, like smoke on the wind. The radio screeched, "All units, fall back, they're breaching thee." The transmission cut off. Silence. Auntie dragged himself upright, coughing blood. The warehouse was gone. The ghost was gone. Only the dead remained, and the terrible, unspoken truth. The weeping soldier hadn't been a warning. He'd been a witness. And now, so were they. The basement stank of sweat and gun oil, the single oil lamp casting long, wavering shadows across the haggard faces of the men. Auntie leaned against the damp concrete wall, his fingers drumming a restless rhythm on his rifle stock. The argument had been raging for an hour, voices rising and falling like the distant artillery that never ceased. Marco slammed his fist onto the crate between them, making the lamp tremble. "He's warning us. Every time he appears, the shells follow, but he's not bringing them. He's telling us where they'll hit." Luca hunched on an overturned bucket, his bandaged arm cradled to his chest. He pointed at the factory. Then it was leveled. His voice was hoarse. He pointed at the school. Then it was hit. Private Daver, his hands shaking around a half-empty canteen, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. What if he's one of the ones they executed there? What if he's trying to? Enough. Auntie's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "You're drawing fire with this madness. Every time you start whispering about ghosts, the enemy hears it. They use it." He jabbed a finger at Marco. "You're giving them targets." Marco's face twisted. "And you're ignoring the one thing that could save us." A bitter laugh escaped Auntie's throat. "You think a corpse is our salvation? He's not just a corpse." Luca's whisper was barely audible. "He's one of us." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Outside, the wind howled through the ruins, carrying with it the faintest echo of a sob. Every man in the room stiffened. Auntie's jaw clenched. No. But the sound grew, a man's weeping, raw and broken, seeping through the cracks in the foundation like floodwater. Closer than ever. Inside the walls. Daver whimpered, pressing himself against the cellar stairs. He's here. Marco stood slowly, his eyes locked on the darkest corner of the room. No, he's angry. The temperature dropped. Auntie's breath fogged in the sudden chill, his skin prickling. Then movement. A shadow detached itself from the gloom, resolving into the hunched silhouette of the weeping soldier. He was worse now. Far worse. His uniform hung in tattered ribbons, the fabric fused to his rotting flesh. His helmet was gone, revealing the ruin of his face, lips peeled back from blackened teeth, one eye socket a hollow pit, the other brimming with tears that dripped onto the floor with a sound like acid hissing. His fingers, skeletal and trembling, curled into claws at his sides. But it was his voice that froze Auntie's blood. Not a sob, not a wail. Words. You left us to die. The voice was a ruin, wet and broken, but unmistakable. The ghost's jaw worked, his remaining eye burning into Auntie's. You ran. While they shot us in the square, Auntie's breath caught. The massacre site, the warehouse. The bodies in Croatian uniforms, left to rot. Marco took a step forward, his own voice shaking. Who are you? The ghost's head turned with a sickening creak of bone. You know. Luca made a sound like a wounded animal. The patrol. The one that went missing last month. They executed us, the ghost hissed. For refusing to burn the houses. For refusing to shoot civilians. His skeletal hand rose, pointing at Auntie. You were supposed to be our backup. You never came. The radio on the table crackled to life. A burst of static. Then, clear as death, enemy advancing north sector, all units. The ghost's head snapped toward the sound. His weeping returned, louder now. A torrent of grief and rage. Too late. Again. Auntie's hands shook. We didn't know. Liar, the ghost's shriek split the air, the lamp flaring bright before guttering out. In the sudden darkness, his form seemed to swell, the rot spreading, his flesh sloughing off in great blackened strips. You knew. You all knew. The first shell hit the building above them. Dust rained from the ceiling as the men scrambled, shouting. Auntie lunged for the radio, but the ghost was faster. His decayed hand closed around Auntie's wrist, the touch like ice and fire. Look at me, the ghost whispered, his face inches from Auntie's, the stench of the grave thick between them. Look at what you did. Then silence. The ghost vanished. The radio died. And outside, the night erupted in gunfire. Marco hauled Auntie toward the stairs. We have to move. Auntie didn't resist. His wrist burned where the ghost had touched him, the skin already mottling in ugly gray. Lucas stared at him, his face pale in the flashes of artillery. He wasn't warning us about the shells, he whispered. He was warning us about you. Another impact shook the foundations. The ceiling groaned. And as the men fled into the hellish night, Auntie knew. The dead had spoken, and the living would never forget. The night was too quiet. Auntie crouched in the ruins of the old hospital, his fingers tracing the cold metal of his rifle. The men around him were silent, hollow-eyed, gaunt, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and mud. The last radio transmission had been hours ago, Yugoslav forces tightening the noose, armor moving into position. The final push was coming, and the weeping hadn't stopped all night. It drifted through the shattered windows now, a low, broken sound that wormed its way into the bones. Luca sat with his back against the wall, his hands pressed over his ears, his lips moving in silent prayer. Marco smoked the last of his cigarettes, the ember trembling between his fingers. Daver, barely more than a boy, curled into himself. "He's getting louder," he whispered. Auntie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The ghost sobs were closer than ever, not outside, not in the ruins, but inside the hospital. Echoing down the scorched hallways, seeping through the bullet-riddled walls. Marco exhaled smoke. He knows what's coming. Luca's laugh was brittle. Or he's bringing it. A gust of wind howled through the broken windows, carrying the stench of burning rubber and wet earth. Beneath it, the weeping swelled raw, wet, choking, the sound of a man drowning in his own grief. Then, from the hallway, a footstep. The men froze. Another. Slow. Deliberate. The crunch of broken glass under a rotting boot. Auntie's grip tightened on his rifle. His pulse hammered in his throat. He didn't need to look to know. The ghost was here. Closer than ever. Marco stood slowly, his knife glinting in the moonlight. "Show yourself." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a whisper, so soft it might have been the wind. "They're coming." Luca whimpered. The radio crackled to life, a burst of static. A voice, broken. "All units, final assault prepare for." The transmission cut off. The weeping surged, a wail so loud it seemed to shake the walls. And in the doorway, the ghost appeared. He was barely a man anymore, just tattered cloth stretched over rotting bone, his face a ruin of peeling flesh and exposed teeth. His helmet was gone, his skull cracked open like an egg, the wound glistening in the dim light. But his eyes, those terrible, weeping eyes, were alive with sorrow. He raised a skeletal hand, not pointing, not counting. Begging. Auntie's breath caught. "What do you want?" The ghost's mouth moved. No sound came out, but the words echoed in Auntie's skull anyway, clear as gunfire. "Don't let them die like I did." Then movement outside. The crunch of boots on rubble. The clank of metal. The Yugoslavs were here. The ghost's wail rose to a shriek, his form flickering like a dying flame. For a heartbeat, he seemed to stretch toward Auntie, toward the men, toward the advancing shadows beyond the windows. Then he was gone. The weeping stopped. The silence was worse. Marco spat. "We make our stand here." Luca's hands shook as he loaded his rifle. He was trying to save us. Auntie didn't answer. He stared at the empty doorway where the ghost had stood, the weight of those final words pressing down on him like a tombstone. Outside, the first mortar screamed in. The world erupted in fire. And as the hospital collapsed around them, Auntie wondered, had the ghost been warning them? Or had he been warning them all along? The last thing he heard before the smoke swallowed everything was not the roar of artillery, not the screams of his men. It was the distant sound of weeping, fading into the wind. The lull in fighting was worse than the battle. Auntie crouched in the trench, his fingers numb around his rifle, the silence pressing against his eardrums like a physical weight. The men around him were husks hollow-eyed, lips cracked from thirst, their uniforms stiff with dried blood and mud. The last Yugoslav assault had been repelled hours ago, but the air still hummed with tension, thick with the promise of another attack. Then the weeping began. Not distant this time. Not drifting through the ruins like a half-heard rumor. Inside the trench. Luca flinched, his breath hitching. He's here. Auntie didn't need to look. The air had gone cold. The stench of damp earth and gunpowder suddenly laced with something foul or rotting flesh, wet soil, the copper tang of old blood. He turned slowly, his joints protesting, his skin prickling with dread. The ghost stood at the far end of the trench, his silhouette hunched, his helmet rusted to his skull. Moonlight glinted off the exposed bone of his jaw, the tattered remains of his uniform fluttering in a wind that didn't touch the living. His face, what remained of it, was a ruin of peeling skin and weeping sores, his lips pulled back in a silent scream. But his eyes, God, his eyes were alive with sorrow, locked onto Auntie's with an intensity that made his stomach twist. Marco exhaled sharply, crossing himself, closer than ever. The ghost took a step forward. The mud didn't shift beneath his boots. Luca whimpered, pressing himself against the trench wall. "He's looking at you, Sergeant." Auntie's throat tightened. The ghost's gaze was unbearable, a bottomless well of grief and accusation. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, in the faces of the men they'd left behind. The ghost raised a skeletal hand, not pointing, not counting, reaching. Auntie's breath fogged in the sudden chill. "What do you want?" The ghost's mouth moved. No sound came out, but the words slithered into Auntie's skull anyway, cold as a grave. "You know." Then movement. The ghost's outstretched hand trembled, fingers curling inward, as if clutching at an old wound. His remaining eye brimmed with tears that dripped onto the mud, sizzling like acid. A whisper, "You were supposed to save us." The radio crackled to life, a burst of static. A voice, frantic, incoming fire all sectors. The ghost's wail rose, drowning out the warning, his form flickering like a dying flame. For a heartbeat, he seemed to stretch toward Auntie, toward the men, toward the ruins beyond. Then the first shell hit. The world dissolved in fire and noise. Auntie was thrown backward, his vision widening out. When the smoke cleared, the ghost was gone. But the trench wall where he'd stood was untouched, a perfect silhouette of unbroken earth amid the devastation. Luca coughed blood onto the mud. "He wasn't warning us this time," he rasped. Marco's voice was hollow. He was saying goodbye. Outside, the night erupted with the roar of engines, the crunch of boots on rubble. The final assault had begun, and the weeping had stopped. Auntie knew what that meant. They were out of warnings, out of time. The ghost had vanished, and soon they would too. The soldier reached out as if to speak, then disappeared. One moment, he was there, his skeletal fingers inches from Auntie's face, his rotted lips parting around unspoken words. The next, the night swallowed him whole, no fade, no flicker. Just gone. The silence that followed was worse than the weeping. Luca made a sound like a wounded animal. "Where?" A mortar screamed in before he could finish. The explosion threw Auntie into the trench wall, dirt raining down as the world dissolved into chaos. Shouting, gunfire, the metallic screech of advancing armor. But Auntie barely heard it. His skin burned where the ghost's fingers had almost touched him, a phantom brand, searing through fabric and flesh alike. He clutched his wrist, the flesh already mottling an ugly gray, the veins beneath darkening like ink spreading in water. Marco grabbed his shoulder, shouting over the din, "We have to fall back." Auntie didn't move. His gaze locked onto the empty space where the ghost had stood. The mud there was untouched, no footprints, no disturbance, just a perfect circle of damp earth, as if the world itself refused to acknowledge what had been there. Luca scrambled to his knees, his face streaked with dirt and blood. He was trying to tell us something. "Did you see?" A bullet whined past, close enough to part his hair, Marco yanked Ante backward. They're flanking us. Move. The men stumbled through the smoke, their boots slipping in the churned mud. Ante's wrist throbbed, the pain radiating up his arm like a poison. He glanced back once just in time to see the trench collapse under a direct hit, the earth swallowing the ghost's last footprint whole. They ran through the skeletal remains of a bombed-out apartment block. Past the corpse of a gutted tank, its turret twisted toward the sky like a broken finger. The city was a graveyard, every shattered window a dead eye watching them flee. Then, a sob. Not from behind. Not from the ruins, from ahead. Wager. Lucas skidded to a halt, his breath ragged. No, he's gone. He can't be. The weeping swelled, raw and wet, threading through the gunfire like a blade. And there, at the mouth of an alley, the ghost. But not as they'd last seen him. His uniform was pristine now, his helmet polished, his face whole. Young. A boy, really no older than Daver had been. He stood straight-backed, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his eyes clear and bright. Alive. Marco's knife clattered to the ground. Christ. That's him. Before. The ghost, no. The soldier looked past them, toward the advancing enemy. His mouth moved, but the words were lost beneath another mortar's shriek. Then the illusion shattered. His body jerked, his chest exploding in a spray of crimson. His helmet flew off as he crumpled, his face contorted in agony. By the time he hit the ground, he was rotting flesh sloughing off bone, uniform fraying to tatters. The weeping soldier. As he died. As he'd been dying every time they saw him. Luca retched into the dirt. Ante's wrist burned hotter, the gray flesh creeping toward his elbow. He knew, then, what the ghost had been trying to say. You were supposed to save us. Not just the executed patrol. All of them. The radio on Marco's belt crackled, a voice breaking through the static. All units retreat to the river. It's over. Dow. The ghost's corpse twitched. His head turned, his remaining eye fixing on Ante. His lips peeled back from blackened teeth in something too grim to be a smile. Too late, he whispered. Then the artillery found them. The world went white. When Ante came to, the alley was gone. The ghost was gone. Only the river remained, its dark waters choked with bodies. And the weeping. The weeping had finally stopped. The riverbank was a slaughterhouse. Ante dragged himself through the mud, his vision swimming, the taste of blood thick on his tongue. Around him, the remnants of his unit staggered Luca with his arm hanging limp, Marco's face a mask of soot and shrapnel wounds. The radio had gone silent an hour ago. No orders, no reinforcements, just the endless thunder of Yugoslav artillery and the screams of men who hadn't been fast enough. Then the weeping began. Not from the ruins, not from the dark, from the river itself. Luca froze, his good hand clutching at Ante's sleeve. He's here. The water rippled, though the night was still. A shape emerged, pale hands breaking the surface, fingers curled like claws. The weeping soldier rose, his uniform bloated with river water, his flesh sloughing off in gray strands. His helmet was gone, his skull cracked open like an egg, the wound glistening under the moonlight. But his eyes, those terrible, weeping eyes, were fixed on Ante. Marco spat into the mud. Come to gloat? The ghost's mouth moved. No sound came out, but the words slithered into Ante's skull all the same. You should have run when I told you. Ante's wrist burned where the ghost had almost touched him. the gray flesh now creeping past his elbow. He gritted his teeth. We held the line. The ghost's laughter was the sound of bones breaking. You held nothing. You died weeks ago. You just didn't know it yet. Luca whimpered, pressing his forehead to the mud. We're already dead. The weeping swelled, merging with the distant cries of the dying. The ghost's form flickered rotting soldier one moment, fresh-faced boy the next, his chest blooming red with the bullet wounds that had killed him. The others are waiting, he whispered, the ones you left behind. The radio crackled to life one final time. Not a voice, not static, weeping. A chorus of it, rising from the river, from the ruins, from the throats of the men still breathing. Marco lifted his rifle with shaking hands. Then let's not keep them waiting. The Yugoslav machine guns opened up as they charged. Ante didn't feel the bullets. Only the ghost's hand, finally solid, finally real, closing around his rotting wrist. Come home, the weeping soldier whispered. And the river swallowed them all. The world had narrowed to smoke and gunfire, the Croatian line collapsing like sand before the tide. Ante stumbled through the ruins, his rifle long abandoned, his vision blurred by blood and exhaustion. Around him, men fell, some to bullets, others to the weight of their own broken bodies. The river was a graveyard, its dark waters choked with the dead. Then, through the chaos, a sob, not from the dying, not from the wind. Him. Ante turned. The weeping soldier stood amid the carnage, untouched by the bullets cutting through the air. His uniform was whole now, his face unmarred, a young man, barely older than Luca had been. His eyes, clear and bright, held no accusation, only sorrow. Marco, slumped against a shattered wall, coughed blood onto his chest. Look at that, he rasped. He's finally stopped crying. The ghost stepped forward, his boots leaving no imprint in the mud. He reached out, his hand hovering just above Ante's shoulder, not touching. Not yet. It's over, he whispered. The words settled in Ante's bones like a truth he'd always known. Somewhere behind them, a tank's engine roared to life. The ghost didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on Ante, his outstretched hand trembling not in fear, but in relief. Luca, half submerged in the river's edge, lifted his head. He's not pointing this time, he murmured. Marco laughed, the sound wet and broken. No, he's welcoming. The ghost's lips curved into something almost like a smile. Then, slowly, he turned his palm upward, an invitation. Ante's breath hitched. His wrist, gray and lifeless, ached with a pain beyond flesh. He knew what came next. Knew it in the way the gunfire seemed to slow, the way the smoke curled around the ghost like a shroud. The war was lost. But the ghost had never been fighting it. Ante reached out. Their fingers brushed, and the world dissolved. The tank's shell hit the riverbank a heartbeat later, the explosion swallowing the last of the Croatian resistance in fire and noise. When the smoke cleared, there were no bodies. Only the faintest echo of weeping, fading into the wind. And the ghost, standing alone on the battlefield, his face finally at peace. Then he too was gone. The war raged on. But in Vukovar, the dead had finally found their rest. The silence was the worst part. No artillery, no gunfire, not even the whisper of wind through the ruins, just the heavy, suffocating quiet of a world holding its breath. Ante sat on the broken steps of what had once been a school, his rifle across his knees, his hands trembling. Around him, the survivors of his unit huddled in the wreckage, their faces hollow with exhaustion and grief. Luca was gone. Marco too. Most of them, really. The river had taken what the shells hadn't. And the weeping had stopped. Daver, the youngest left alive, picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Do you think he's still out there?" Auntie didn't answer. He didn't need to. The ghost had vanished with the last of the fighting, his final whisper still ringing in Auntie's ears. It's over. But the silence was worse than the weeping. Because now there was no warning before the shells fell. A radio crackled to life somewhere in the ruins, a burst of static cutting through the quiet. A voice, broken and distant, "Any survivors report." No one moved to answer it. Auntie closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he could still see the ghost's face, not the rotted specter from the trenches, but the boy he'd been before the bullets found him. Young, scared, alive. Daver shifted beside him. "They'll send us back to the front, won't they?" Auntie exhaled slowly. The war wasn't done with them yet. But the ghost was. And that, somehow, was the cruelest cut of all. Because in the end, the weeping soldier hadn't been a warning. He'd been a mercy. And now, there was no one left to mourn them. Years later, the veterans spoke of him in hushed tones. In the dim corners of smoke-filled bars, where the air was thick with the scent of cheap liquor and old wounds, they whispered about the weeping soldier. Some claimed he still walked the ruins of Vukovar, his spectral boots treading the same shattered streets where he'd once fought and died. Others swore they'd seen him in the mist that clung to the riverbanks at dawn, his tattered uniform fluttering like a battle flag no one could lower. Marco, who had survived the river but not the memories, was the first to say it aloud. "He wasn't just a ghost," he muttered, tracing the rim of his glass with a finger that still trembled after all these years. He was a reckoning. The younger men, those who hadn't been there, who only knew the war from stories and scars, leaned in, their eyes wide. "You really saw him?" Marco's laugh was a dry, broken thing. "Saw him? He saved my life, counted the shells before they fell, pointed where death was coming." He took a long drag of his cigarette, the ember flaring in the dim light. And when the end came, he was the only one who didn't lie to us. Auntie, who rarely spoke of those days, sat in the corner, his wrist still mottled gray where the ghost had almost touched him. The doctors called it necrosis. Auntie called it a reminder. Across the table, Luca's brother, a boy who had been too young to fight but old enough to inherit the grief, frowned. "If he was trying to save you, why did you all die anyway?" The bar went quiet. Marco's cigarette burned down to the filter. Auntie finally looked up, his voice rough as gravel. "Because some things aren't about surviving. They're about bearing witness." Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest echo of a sound no one but the veterans could hear. A sob, raw, endless. The men stiffened, their glasses freezing halfway to their lips. Marco's hand shook as he crossed himself. Auntie didn't react. He just stared at the door, his face unreadable. Because he knew what the others refused to admit. The weeping soldier had never left. He was still out there. Still mourning. Still counting. And one day, when the wind was right and the night was still, he would come back to collect what the war had forgotten.